The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com. Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, you're listening to New Books in History. I'm your host, Dexter Fergie. Today I'm speaking with the editors of an important new edited volume titled Organizing the 20th Century World, International Organizations and the Emergence of International Public Administration, 1920s to 1960s. The editors are Karen Graham Skol-Ajer, Håkon Economo, and Torsten Kallard. The history of global governance has been an exciting area of research in recent years, with such landmark studies as Susan Peterson's Guardians and Adam Getachu's World Making After Empire. And we've learned lots about, say, the politics of creating new intergovernmental organizations. Yet the international bureaucracies themselves still remain mysterious, almost black boxed. And this book, Organizing the 20th Century World, helps to correct this. Its contributions tell the history of international bureaucracies, as well as providing methodological tools for helping future research. And so, Karen, Håkon, and Torsten, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to begin with a discussion about the research team that you are all members of. And so it's called the Invention of International Bureaucracy Research Project. And maybe, Karen, do you want to say a little bit about this?
Yes, sure. So the project was running from 2015 and we wrapped it up last year. It's a project that was funded by the Danish National Research Council. And essentially, we got money to have 4 researchers working on the League of Nations and international public administration in that context. So that's what we've been doing, and which is part of also what's in the book now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, coming from North America, these research projects involving multiple people at different stages of their career, it just seems like a completely alternative way of doing scholarship, and I'm interested in it on those terms alone. But maybe to jump into the historiography would be a good place to direct our conversation. And so I'm just curious how the three of you see the history of international bureaucracies or the history of global governance. Like what have been some of the major themes or threads, maybe limits?
Should I take this one?
Sure.
Well, I think we've come to the conclusion that there are roughly 4 kind of waves of literature, particularly concerning the League of Nations Secretariat, but also the United Nations. And the first wave is those that were part of the first experiment in international public administration, the League of Nations Secretariat themselves, and published kind of work during the lifespan of the organization, and also afterwards summing up kind of the experience of it, very much on the premise of trying to tell future international organizations what their experiences were, what kind of successes the league actually entailed, and also some of the kind of the pitfalls, warnings, etc. But really trying to convey also that the setting up of an international public administration in the way that the league did it was a revolution in itself. That it had kind of an intrinsic value, and as we've seen also all the way up to today, quite a long legacy. And then there is perhaps a long lull of interest in the secretariats of and public administrations of international organizations from the historical side, not necessarily from political scientists, but in the post-war years and in the Cold War era, you have from historians a very traditional kind of perspective on international public administrations, particularly taking an interest in the secretary generals of the League and of the UN, often comparing them, but following them as kind of diplomatic actors, and often diplomatic actors that are hugely constrained in their ability to shape policy outcomes and multilateral negotiations. And so this becomes the main prism of a kind of a second wave of literature. And then the third wave is perhaps the transnational turn in international history, where the bureaucracies come back in a sense, but not as institutions necessarily, but more as networks of expertise, of epistemic communities, of like-minded individuals that are working on specific policy fields in the language of global governance somehow. And then the fourth wave is perhaps where we come in, where the point is to bring the institution back in, the role of the international civil servant back in, and see how that genealogy shapes both the international organizations in question, but also actual policy processes. So, in a sense, taking bureaucracy seriously. So, I think that's kind of some of the main traits. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
No, I think you are absolutely right in portraying the historiography like that, Håkon. I think maybe one thing that you could add is that I guess one of our considerations at least have been that now is a very good time to take institutions seriously, because the recent trends in international historiography has given us a lot of new tools to work with institutions. And that's also what we've tried to do in this volume, and say, so what happens if we look at an international public administration from a prosopographical point of view, from a biographical point of view, from a more traditional leadership point of view, sort of test out different ways of looking at this entity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good way to set up our conversation. One thing that I was thinking about was, before this third wave, to use your terms, there wasn't all that much interest in, in the League of Nations, but then also more specifically in the international public administrations. And I'm just wondering what that sort of lack of research or interest did to our more general understanding of international history. What were some of the consequences for our understanding of 20th century international history when we weren't thinking about international public administration?
Who wants to take this one?
Yeah, it is a big one. Well, I can give it a go, and then we can see where it takes us. But I think one thing to consider when we look at the lack of interest in international public administration for a very long time is that it's closely connected with the overall approach that dominated international history at the time. So there was a strong trend where international historians viewed international politics and international organizations from sort of a not very explicit and developed, but still a fairly consistent sort of near-realist point of view, which meant that institutions in general were not given a lot of interest, and that goes for administration as well as other institutional dimensions of international politics. So I think we need to consider it in that context, that to the extent that international organizations were being researched, it was the big decisions about how they were created and which state interests drove those processes that led to the setup of new multilateral bodies after the Second World War, and what states gained from participating in them. So it was a very particular perspective on international organizations in general that was then challenged with more recent transnational ways of approaching international politics, I suppose.
Yeah, I could perhaps add that there is also the slow kind of broadening of what international politics entails that has come into the field over the past I don't know how many decades, but for each kind of new generation of historians, have been added perspectives to what international history is, from being diplomatic history in essence to being international history, which entails economic policies, domestic politics, intelligence, and these kind of things. And then I think with the transnational turn, kind of expanding to include health governance, to include transit governance, and these kind of fields that are attached to international organizations and developed through international organizations, which I think has brought in a completely new lenses, if you will, to revisit these organizations, not as merely multilateral diplomatic arenas, but as entities that produce ways of governing specific policy fields. And once you, as Patricia Clavin, I believe, called it kind of inside out perspective. So going inside the organization and taking that as a vantage point to study economic governance or health governance or what have you, that kind of that changes the questions you ask, and also has quite clearly in the last 20 years opened up for some very interesting new ways of telling the history of the interwar period, for example.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I really, really like about this volume is its attention to these methodological tools. And so, you have a chapter by Bob Rinalda on using the Biographical Dictionary of Secretaries General of International Organizations, Håkon's chapter on biography as this institutional can opener. And then Torsten, you use the LONSEA, the LONSEA database, and you also use data visualization. And so, Torsten, I would love to start with your chapter. You call your method prosopography, which is a word that I did not know until I read your chapter. And so I'm just curious, like what that is and how you've used it to understand the League of Nations.
Yes, thanks for the question. So maybe I start with the basis of it, the LONSEA or LONSEA database. So when we started the project, we we didn't know of this database. It was very much in the beginning that we heard about it, and then we were in a way lucky to quite quickly get the whole database from the people who produced them, which was a team around Madeleine Herron in Heidelberg. And they have spent a lot of work in producing a database which contains all international civil servants, not only the one from the League of Nations, but also around them, based on a lot of material which was produced during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And we could make use of this database, and we introduced our own digital setup. I wouldn't claim that we really did digital history, but at least we produced some graphical representation by doing statistical computation. And we were also getting help for that from the department at Aarhus University. So it is also kind of a question where you need maybe help from people who are really into computational technology. So that was basically the start of this prosopographical approach, and usually a word which is really difficult to pronounce, prosopography. It's more used or I knew it more from fields like ancient history or medieval history. So they, for example, use it when you have groups of people where you have very little data, very little information. So you can use it to ask questions about the character of a group by putting together this little data you have. So you could find out something about average age or the gender distribution or networks of people. So it is in a way, and you say it's quite new still in the field of international history, but I think it's worth looking at it, especially as has been said, that it's still kind of a black box that we're looking at when we look at international administrations. So we still know little about the man and women behind the man in a way. So that was kind of the starting point. And so what I tried to open there was a bit this changing composition. So first the composition overall, and then also to try to get into this complex organization by looking at how it evolved over time, and then slicing it into different parts of it. So by looking at, for example, only the gender distribution over time, or which is also a big question, looking at the national distribution and how it changed over time. So that is a way like to get an insight from a bird's eye view. And what is important maybe in this approach is that it doesn't give you the whole picture. So that was at least my experience, that you need the other perspective to really answer questions. So you need like context information, you need the micro perspective, and that it's also where it fits very well with, for example, Hawkins' approach, to look like from the other side, from just one person and his biography. So I also try to add more information to the database and to the careers of the people, so where they end up after having been in the organization, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually didn't know that it was a method that was used more in ancient history. So that's kind of a cool like appropriation of another sort of subfield's methodology. But something that I found amazing about this is the data visualization that you do. And so, I mean, you've done really cool statistical work to just like as you put it, like slice up the league in different ways, you know, by gender, national origins, that sort of thing. And the outcome is really, really interesting. I mean, one of your graphs shows how 90% of all higher officials in the League of Nations were European, and almost all of them were British or French. And by contrast, less than 2% were South American. And so, I mean, like we know that the League was a very European entity, but to kind of have these numbers, I find extremely useful. Do you want to say something about that? Maybe those particular numbers?
Yes, for sure. The interesting point for me was that you can view these numbers in two different ways. So you can say, which is maybe not the surprising result of it, that it was mainly European and even Western European, and also in its higher echelons, male-dominated organization. But you can also use this data to turn this a bit around. So and this is what I meant. If you look at it from a time perspective, if you look at how it evolves, you can see that it changes a bit towards a more multinational organization towards the 1930s, even though it resists in general a very radical change. So once it was set up in the beginning, it remained basically in the same percentage of European and South American or other member states. But you can see some trends, and this is doable with this kind of data, that you can map out these trends. And if you take the South Americans, of course, they were not quite happy with being less represented than other nations. So it was a current topic, and so there were also ways, and this is where context and knowledge, of course, comes into play. So there were ways to try to get around this. So, for example, they set up an South American bureau in I don't know where it was actually. To get them more involved into the secretariat and to please the interest of these member states. So it's kind of this balancing of interest of different member states, which is what one feature of, for example, the appointment policy through the whole time, and nationality played an important role in that. So it was kind of a changing currency in a way. So you would be very well off in the beginning if you were British or French to get to land a position, but that would become more difficult during the mid 1920s when complaints about the dominance of the British and the French were coming more recurrent, especially from the assembly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a really productive approach, and I'm really excited to see what else you do with it, or what else other people do with it. And you mentioned, and I also mentioned Håkon's approach, which is sort of another way to get into this sort of mysterious black box organization. And so, Håkon, you have this really great metaphor. You're using biography as an institutional can opener. And so I'm just curious, like, how can a biography, open up the can of the institution?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I have to second what Torsten says, which is that the biographical approach, I think, also is kind of enhanced by having the bird's eye perspective. So I think the biographical approach has really, for me, it's been something that has matured, I would say, by also being part of and working with and looking at Torsten's work, and kind of learning what the institution looks like from a bird's eye perspective, and then perhaps also another perspective, which is the kind of the formal rules and norms of the institution, which is something Karen and I have worked quite a lot with, and also Torsten and Emil Seidenfaden, who was the PhD on the project. So with those two things in mind, you have the formal rules and you have the bird's eye perspective of how the institution is composed in many ways, that's where the biography then becomes a different way of getting into the organization, into the League of Nations Secretariat in this instance. And the biography, I think, has some advantages because it comes from, quite naturally, from a very specific vantage point. So the biography is one person's way into and work within an institution. This is then, you could say, a forced decentering of some of the established truths about how an institution works. So with that starting point, you come in with a person. I'm writing about a Greek or Ottoman Greek official called Thanasis Agnides, and his way in is very peculiar, and his trajectory is extraordinary in many ways. So this is, we need to keep in mind, obviously, it's not easy to generalize from such a biography, but on the other hand, it serves as a very distinct prism to question some established truths about how things work. So this is what I've tried to do with this chapter, and to use it as I call it, an institutional can opener. So I follow Thanasis Agnides' road into the League of Nations Secretariat and his work on a very specific case of the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in 1923. So by doing that, I can kind of get at two very basic things that are happening inside a secretariat like the League of Nations Secretariat, namely hiring of people, staffing, and being assigned a task. And so I can kind of use that prism to question two formal rules, namely the rule of kind of recruiting officials by their by formal procedures based on their skills, etc. Things that are established inside the League Secretariat later on, but in the early years of the Secretariat, it's really quite haphazard, and it happens very quickly. And Sir Eric Drummond, the first Secretary General, really uses the Paris Peace Conference as a kind of the best pool in the world to recruit his core staff, going to London and then later to Geneva. And so how you end up in that kind of secretariat is quite interesting. It doesn't necessarily have to do with any formal procedures. It doesn't necessarily have to do with skill sets either, but it can. But it has to do with networks, chance, and as I also found out, it has to do with being of the right persuasion. So quite a lot of this first generation of people are quite in sync when it comes to their way of thinking about what the league is, and what the kind of the league's spirit ought to be, and so it's a very peculiar first generation of higher officials, but also a generation that stays on for a very long time, as Thorsten has also shown. So they have a lot of influence. So these connections between this skewed approach, which you get from the biography, and then the more aggregated data that you get from, for example, prosopography and the formal rules, I think is quite interesting. That's one thing that the biography can do. And then obviously another thing that it can do is to link the personal and the professional. And this, I think, has proven quite important for my research, at least. And I think it's quite healthy also to think about when dealing with diplomacy and international bureaucracies, that we're not kind of tricked into believing wholesale the formal rules that are presented to us, but rather inquire whether in practice this is actually how it works. And I can perhaps leave it at that and expand on it if necessary. But that's also what a thing that the biography is good at, I would say.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes, I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's a helpful layout of what this approach can do. I think it would be useful to hear a little bit more about Agnidas himself. In particular, I was thinking about like the story of how he even got hired by the League of Nations in the first place, or the the connection to Harold Nicholson and the recommendation letter, and like in this you can kind of see the importance of empire and diplomacy. So can you just share a little bit
Yeah,
about
I can do the
this?
short version of it. I mean, it is a striking road in, but then if you investigate other people getting in, particularly in the early phase there, I think you will find that they all have quite extraordinary trajectories. But Thanasis Agnidas was born in the Ottoman Empire in Nigde, in the Anatolian highlands, so really far from high politics and really far from Geneva or any kind of diplomatic scene. So he was there, but he was a really excellent student. He was um, educated at all these religious institutions that were particularly in the late Ottoman era quite prevalent. So he had like a Protestant and a Catholic and a Greek Orthodox education. And particularly his time at the Anatolia College, which was American Protestant run, was quite foundational for him in getting a kind of a liberal religious internationalist outlook, which shaped him quite a lot. And then obviously with things becoming quite difficult for the Greek Orthodox minority in the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the century, he leaves. He after having moved to Constantinople for a while and educating himself, took a law degree, but at the same time being involved in this expat networks of French and British and other diplomats there. And this is where he encounters Harold Nicholson, the not at the time very famous, but soon to be very famous British diplomat. He was then a young secretary at the embassy in Constantinople, and he became his Turkish tutor. And they became friends, and they have quite an affectionate friendship that lasts their entire life. But it starts there in 1910-11 in Constantinople. But then he leaves for France through his family networks, which are scattered all over Europe. So via Belgium to France, he retakes his degree in law in Paris, and is there kind of enmeshed into the politics and the kind of informal diplomatic milieu and propaganda milieu of Venizelos, Eleftherios Venizelos, the Greek liberal statesman, who is at the time first trying to bring Greece into the war on the side of Britain and France, and then tries through that to pursue the idea of a greater Greece, e megaliidea, so to expand the territory of Greece, to reclaim, as they say, quote, unquote, areas also in Asia Minor where there is a historical Orthodox Greek population. So Agnidis becomes involved in this and is recruited through his passionate interest for Greek culture and music, and obviously with his legal degree in hand, and becomes a very useful asset for Venizelos. And then at the end of the First World War, he has what I think is a kind of a personal dispute with someone in the Greek Foreign Service, and ends up being kind of out of a job and wandering the streets of Paris around just around the time of the Paris Peace Conference. So he bumps into Harold Nicholson, who's then part of the British delegation, and basically tells him, I'm out of a job and I need a job. And Harold Nicholson tells him, well, I've just been recruited by Sir Eric Drummond to this Secretariat of the League of Nations, and I think I will write him and recommend you. And so he writes and recommends and tells Sir Eric Drummond that I have this Greek guy and I think he would be perfect. So there he is. He has his British imperial connections from Constantinople, and has also recommendation letters from that. He has recommendations from Venizelos and Politis, these kind of big Greek liberal statesmen. He has the personal connection with Harold Nicholson. And then there is the pull factor, which is Sir Eric Drummond is at the time scouting for talent basically in Paris and trying to recruit as many as possible of a core staff, and quite clearly is also kind of lacking knowledge, expertise on the area of the former Ottoman Empire and Greece and the Balkans. So he has by then legal training, and as well diplomatic, a little bit of diplomatic experience. So he glides in there. But then the kind of the thing that is the most one of the most important assets is that he has also shown himself through his writings, through his connections, through his practice, particularly in the war years, that he is of the right mindset, that he is of the right kind of ideological persuasion, if you will. And this is also hugely important to land him the job. And this is why Harold Nicholson recommends him. So this was not a very short version, but that's how he gets into the league. And it shows very much the kind of the unbureaucratic nature of early recruitments. And it also shows the importance of beliefs and networks like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that story is really useful. I mean, it's a really nice demonstration of your approach, but then it's also really useful to illustrate the, like in a biography, you can see all these like really big structures that are kind of channeling and incentivizing and constraining, but then you also see this contingency, and so. It's like in these two things that you have like a really interesting story about how recruitment happened in the early days of the League of Nations. I want to jump ahead to your chapter, Håkon, and Karen's chapter, in which you focus on, and this is me quoting you, because I think this is a really great phrase, an entirely new professional figure on the international stage, the international civil servant. And so, Karen, can you say how the League of Nations helped establish this new actor on the international stage?
Yes, absolutely. So to pick up on what Håkon and Torsten have been saying, this chapter sort of represents a third perspective, adding to the prosopographical and the biographical approach. What we try to do in this chapter is to look at the formal construction of the international civil servant, so the norms and the rules that produces this new international figure that is the international bureaucrat. And we claim in the chapter, and I think we're right in doing that, that the League of Nations represents a major breakthrough for this international professional figure for a couple of reasons. One is some very important early decisions that the first Secretary General of the League of Nations, Eric Drummond, took when he was given the job of setting up the Secretariat. So in the League Covenant, there were very few rules and pointers as to what this new Secretariat should look like. So he had a lot of room to create the bureaucratic entity the way he wanted it. And one of the decisions that he took very early on was that he wanted an international secretariat proper, understood in the way that he didn't want a secretariat that was made up of national delegations of experts and diplomats, each sort of producing their own input for the secretariat. Instead, he designed the secretariat as a unitary entity which was divided along functional lines. So there are different policy areas in the secretariat: transport, health, finance, and so on. And in each of these sections, you would have a multinational staff that was employed by the Secretariat and that was loyal only to the Secretariat. And that was something completely new on the international stage, and what lays the foundation of us talking about international civil servants in a meaningful way. So that was an important decision that he took, and you can see that developing, and that's what we try to trace in our chapter, how that international loyalty and independence is then fleshed out by giving League civil servants diplomatic privileges and immunities, by having them swear an oath of loyalty from the early 1930s, of making sure that they don't work for other organizations while working for the League, making sure that there's a pension system so they can stay on long term and make a living and a career out of it. So you create a new profession where you can actually live your whole professional life inside the organization. But what we also try to show in the chapter is that it is a very important defining feature of the international civil servant, that he or she also needs to be in close contact with his or her home government. So what Drummond realizes very early on is that for the Secretariat to have any kind of legitimacy, member states need to feel represented in the Secretariat. And as Torsten talked about, that wasn't really the case from the start, where it was heavily dominated by France and Germany. So you have ongoing negotiations through the interwar period about taking on new staff. Where should they be coming from? Which countries are particularly underrepresented? At which point in the hierarchy of the organization does a particular nationality fit in? At what level should a particular country be represented? And that is sort of an ongoing discussion in all staff appointments. So what we try to show is that there is this built-in dilemma between having an international civil service that is independent, that is neutral, that represents a general international interest, and at the same time that has sufficiently close contacts with member state governments, and also symbolically representing a broad range of member states for it to have legitimacy and be able to operate efficiently politically. And that's what we try to develop in the chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I like about this, and then I mean, so I think this is something that this chapter does really well. But then also, I think the book itself is doing this a little bit more generally. There's this older popular thesis that you still hear, that the League of Nations was a failure. But what you are arguing is that the League of Nations very successfully, introduced a new form of, like international behavior, or a new international identity in the international civil servant. And I think that's a really useful argument to have.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's sort of the key point we want to make. But I think what we also try to show is that it's not only making an impact through sort of its positive example. It's also being critically evaluated by some of the international organization representatives after the Second World War. So Dag Hammarskjöld, for instance, or Jean Monnet, who are working in the UN and in early European integration, respectively, also see the shortcomings of the Secretariat and how relatively impotent it was. What were the limits of a very sort of neutral, hesitant, discreet international civil service, and having, for instance, Jean Monnet arguing for a much more activist, supranational and technocratic kind of international bureaucrat to drive international cooperation. So there's both a positive and a negative example story built in, I think, in the chapters more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Håkon, maybe I can rope you in here. This identity persists into the post-war era, and you have this, critical evaluation, as Karen is suggesting. What are some of the things that continue or change or stop in between the interwar era and the post-World War II era? How does the international civil servant evolve?
Yeah, that's a big question, but it's I think it's very good to start with the baseline that Karen mentioned, that the League Secretariat, whether they liked it or not, or whether they would want to build on it or do it differently, it was the baseline experience, and that was unavoidable in the post-war years when they started to build the UN and other international organizations, what we call second generation international organizations. And so just from that, I think there is an enormous amount of work being done, particularly during the Second World War. You have the Carnegie Endowment, you have, so the Carnegie Endowment tries to gather as many League officials as possible and have big conferences with them to try to interview them on different topics of international organization, and particularly international public administration, and what to do and what to not do. So they're trying to build up a knowledge bank based on the experience of these League officials. At the same time, in London during the Second World War, Sir Eric Drummond is trying to gather, and successfully gathers, a small team of former League officials in London during the Second World War, and they write the so-called London Report, which is also a kind of a summary of experiences and a passing on of knowledge to the next generation of international organizations that are to take shape. So that's one thing where there is a very strong connection, and where there is a lot of, you could say, active work on the part of the former League officials in trying to pass on the baton. And this is also where the first generation of literature on the League public administration comes from. That's these efforts. So no wonder they are a little bit, let's say, trying to show the good side, and also passing on knowledge. So that's one thing. And then in terms of changes and differences, quite clearly there is an experience of the Secretary General, and Karen knows much more on this than I do, but that the Secretaries General were too weak in the League, that they were administrators and not kind of leaders of an international organization. So one of the big changes is, of course, that the Secretary General of the UN can bring things forth to the Security Council, which gives them a political role, which the League Secretaries General never had. but there are also other differences. I think the emphasis on geographical representation inside the Secretariat is much more emphasized from the get-go in the UN, quite clearly out of a concern of legitimacy, but also I think because it's more global from the beginning, so it's a different organization in that sense. And then there is the portioning out of special agencies which have their own peculiar rules, which differ more or less from the core UN staff. And I think that's also an important, let's say, evolution of international public administrations, that they become more and more specialized, even within the UN system, so to speak. And then of course you get all the other additional international organizations like the OAEC, which becomes the OECD, the European Coal and Steel Community, etc. And they use, of course, the League as a baseline, and sometimes they even copy paste staff regulations more or less into their own organizational DNA. But they also, both because they have different jobs to do, but also because they've learned, choose different paths. So you get a much wider range of different kinds of public administrations that can be compared and contrasted. And I would say this is what we try to do in this book as well, to kind of put them side by side and also connect them a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Another question that I had, and I mean, this could be directed at all three of you, is the periodization. I mean, it's really interesting that international public administration doesn't really emerge until the 1920s, and I'm just curious why it happened then, like why it didn't happen earlier, like why you have several antecedent intergovernmental organizations like the ITU, the International Telegraph Union, the Universal Postal Union, things like that. But it does, like, the international civil servant doesn't really emerge, at least in your telling, until later. Does someone want to maybe explain why it happens in the 20s?
Well, I could have a go at that. So I think it has to do with at least two things. One is scale. Like, even if there were previous international organizations, mainly in the form of technical unions and sort of specialized agencies, their number of staff was very limited. It might be 10 or 20 people, whereas at the height of the League Secretariat's existence, it had around a staff of around 700. So there was a completely different scale, which I suppose invited the earlier international organizations to think in local staff and secondments of a few international staff. And also what they were dealing with were mainly technical issues that wasn't politicized to the extent that the League's work was. So the need for broad national representation in terms of legitimizing the League's work was perhaps somewhat stronger than was the case with these smaller and earlier technical unions and agencies.
Wonderful. And we're coming to the end of our conversation right now, and I'm curious. I mean, maybe firstly, what is on the horizon for the Invention of International Bureaucracy research project? Like, can we be expecting other volumes like this or conferences?
Well, the project itself is over. So what is happening?
Oh, okay.
What is happening now is that obviously each member of the project is working on new projects that are all, I think, in different ways related to what we've been been doing. So I am working on a monography on the international civil servant, trying to sort of do a professional biography of that international figure. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about what you're doing, Håkon.
Yeah, I'm doing, I guess, two things. Well, rather three things. I'm writing a biography on Thanasis Agnides. The story is too good to let go, so I'm carrying on with that. And there's a very nice personal archive of him as well. And then another thing I'm doing is trying to carry on building on the prosopography, the work that Torsten has done and the Lonsea database, and try to develop a kind of a research tool where people, where students, researchers can engage with a portal which somehow captures and allows them to in various ways get different statistics about the league secretariat depending on what they're interested in. So kind of an interactive research tool. And then the last thing is that I will be working on disarmament and the League of Nations in particular for the next couple of years. So that's my carrying on of this.
Yeah, just adding a few words on what I do. I mean, the one thing is that I try to assist Håkon with his approach, and I'm very curious about maybe a connection to the Lontat project, which is also maybe worth mentioning. So the digitization project of the League of Nations archive in Geneva, which is still ongoing, but they have already, I think, 80% of their material digitized. So that is an interesting project, but I also changed a bit side. So I'm currently in a library in Lower Saxony working on open access publication infrastructure. So I'm a bit more on the publication side now, but still with all my heart connected to the idealists and the League of Nations team. So I'm happy to do more research on prosopography. And I have still so much material, so there's hopefully coming something soon.
Yeah, well, I mean, all of this sounds super exciting, and I look forward to seeing what all three of you do in the future. And I really want to thank you for speaking with me today. I learned so much just speaking with you. I really enjoyed your book. I think it's an important volume for all the reasons that I stated at the beginning of the conversation. You know, like these organizations, these bureaucracies really are black box in the historiography, and you've found ways to open them up.
Thank you so much for having us, Dexter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And you've been listening to a conversation about organizing the 20th century world, international organizations, and the emergence of international public administration, 1920s to 1960s. And this has been a conversation on the New Books Network on the New Books in History channel.